Hello and welcome again to Economics. Today we're going to finish up our discussion of what's commonly referred to as supply and demand. We've been looking at markets. We've been looking at the behavior of people within markets. We first looked at the behavior of the buyers in the market, which is what we referred to as demand. And then we looked at the behavior of the sellers or the suppliers or the producers in the market, and that we characterized as supply. Today we're going to put the two halves together, the two pieces together, and see what happens when the market clears. Now, we've used the terminology market several times, but we've never really been completely clear about exactly what it is. And oftentimes when people think of markets, they think of particular geographical places, a place. But in fact, markets don't have to be a place. They're simply an exchanging of information between two interested groups. And if you'll remember back to our definition for demand and our definition for supply, you'll remember that we put in the words willing and able. And so when we think about markets, we're really just thinking about all of the people who are willing and able to either buy or sell a particular good and how they interact with one another and how they share information with one another. So when we think as an example of the gold market, there's not a particular location where people exchange gold. In fact, most of the time the gold doesn't actually physically change locations. It's just an exchanging of information which leads to an exchange of the ownership from one person to another. So let's get us a definition for what a market is and exactly what we're looking for. It's the place, or it's the information location where we sort out the differences between the demanders and the suppliers. They're created really to reduce transaction cost. If they are a physical location, it's a place where both the buyers and the sellers collect so that they can swap information with one another. Or it could be online, or it could be through some sort of a broker or any other setup where the information exchanges between the two. The whole idea of a market is to reduce the transaction cost. That is, to make it where the demander or the buyer doesn't have to search out the supply of the good or the service, and in that way it lowers his cost. This originally was identified by Adam Smith, who said that the market moves as with an invisible hand that connects the buyers and the sellers, the demanders and the suppliers. The example we've been using is a pizza market, and we had been looking at what various different groups, how they would participate in the pizza market. And here we've put the two groups together. We had looked at 5 different prices for pizza from $15 to $3. We had asked the buyers, how many would you want at those various different prices? And you see those numbers listed as quantity demanded. And then we ask all of the sellers, the suppliers, the producers, how many they would be willing to supply at those various different prices, and you see those numbers listed there. Now, the first thing that should strike us is that there is a very special price here, and it's known as equilibrium. It's the point at which both the buyers and the sellers are in agreement. At $9, the buyers want to buy $20 million and the sellers want to sell $20 million, and so the two groups are in agreement. If that price were to be reached, there's no reason that it would move from that. Equilibrium simply means that there's no tendency for change. You'll notice that at prices above the equilibrium price, say at $15, at $15 the quantity demanded is 8, the quantity supplied is 28, so we have extra or surplus of 20. So the way we would see that is you go into a pizza parlor and there's stacks and stacks of pizzas and nobody's buying them. Now obviously if that were the case, the tendency would be for the pizza maker to want to sell them at a discount or to drop the price on them, so that you see in the final column out there the effect on price is a fall. And so he would come to the conclusion after a day, well, $15 is too much for a pizza, I better lower the price on it. And then perhaps he would drop it to $12 and he would still have a surplus of $10 million, and he would say, well, that's still not quite cheap enough apparently. Hopefully he would then hit upon a price of $9 and realize that that exactly matches what the wishes of his buyers are. You'll also notice that at a price below $9, say at $3, The demanders want 32 million pizzas because remember they were encouraged by lower prices. There are only 12 million being supplied because remember the suppliers or the producers are discouraged by lower prices. So we end up with a shortage of 20 million pizzas. So naturally the tendency here would be to raise the price. The analogy here is you go in the pizza parlor and there's no pizza available, and so for those that already have them, they can resell their pizzas and actually end up making some money off the deal. So a surplus occurs when we have an excess quantity supplied. The pressure on price is downward. That is, we want to decrease the quantity supplied and increase the quantity demanded. On the other side, when a shortage is an excess quantity demanded, the pressure on price is upward, so we'd want to increase the quantity supplied and decrease the quantity demanded. When we reach the point where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied, then the buyers and the sellers exactly match. That's known as the equilibrium point. The equilibrium quantity and price are equal. The market clears and there's no pressure on price. Price has no reason to move. There's no extra, so you don't want to lower price. There's no shortage, so you don't want to raise price. So at that price point, everybody is satisfied. And that's the point that we see here. And thus the X marks the spot point. And you can see this one is actually drawn the way we've talked about. That is, at a price of $9, there are 20 million pizzas exchange hands. Above that price, there's a difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. The quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded, and we refer to that as a surplus. Below that price, the quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, and so we have a shortage, and so the pressure is upward for price. Now, what happens if we have a change in demand? Notice that this equilibrium only holds as long as there's no change. And I'll remind you that as long as we move along the demand curve, we refer to that as a change in quantity demanded. In other words, if we were to move up or down along the demand curve, the little blue line, then that would be a change in quantity demanded. But what would happen if we had a change in demand? Reminder that when that happens, it's a shift of the demand curve, and it happens for some non-price reason. It's something other than price changes, and we've talked about these in a previous episode in which we talked about a change in income, a substitute or a complement, something of that sort. Suppose we had an increase in demand. If we had an increase in demand, which we could do if we had an increase in income due to, on a normal good, due to whatever causes the income for our particular buyers, then we would have a shift to the right. If we had a decrease in demand, we would have a shift to the left. What would that look like? Well, here we have an increase in demand. Demand curve has moved from D to D prime, and notice the result of that is that we have an increase in price. The new equilibrium price moves from C to G. We simply are moving up the supply curve. So in this case, we've had an increase in demand, but an increase in quantity supplied. So we've stayed on the same supply curve, but we've moved from one point to another on that same supply curve, but we've had an increase in demand, which moves us from C to G, and we go from $9 to $12, and we go from 20 million pizzas to 24 million pizzas. The new equilibrium is at a higher price and a higher quantity. And this is what would happen in a market where suddenly a particular product becomes very fashionable, or in a market where the buyers of the particular product have an income increase, or expectation is for there to be a price increase or something of that sort. But notice the effect of an increase in demand is a higher price and a higher quantity exchanged as well. What happens if something changes on the other side? And reminder that now we're talking about a change in a non-price determinant of supply. We talked about these before. Could be a technological change. The one that's easiest to see is a change in the price of the resource that we use to make it. We could have an increase in supply, which is a rightward shift of the supply curve, or we could have a decrease in supply, which is a leftward shift of the supply curve. If we had an increase in supply, we would move from S to S prime. Our new equilibrium will go from the point marked C to the point marked D. So we go from a price of $9 for the pizzas to a price of $6 for the pizzas. We go from 20 million pizzas per week to 26 million pizzas per week. So if you're thinking, if I'm in a market, which would I rather have change? Obviously, what you would prefer to have change is for the supply to change. You would prefer that they have a decrease in the underlying resources or a new form of technology or less competition for the underlying resources, something of that sort. Because remember, when we had an increase in demand, the price went up. Now we have an increase in supply and the price goes down and the quantity goes up. So this is kind of the best of both worlds. Suppose we had them both to move at once. One of the nice things about dealing with economics in a classroom is that we live in this sort of world where nothing changes, where everything is held constant. And so the question is, what happens in the real world when we have both demand and supply changing? Well, if both supply and demand increase, which is what we've been showing here, the quantity definitely will increase. And the question is, what will happen to price? Because remember, when supply increased, the price dropped, but when demand increased, the price went up. So if the demand shifts more, then the price will increase. If the supply shifts more, then the price will decrease. Again, reminder that what we said was that if supply increases, it has a tendency to force price downward, but if demand increases, it has a tendency to force price upward. So if the two of them are shifting simultaneously, it depends on which one of them moves the most. And if demand moves the most, then the price is going to increase. If supply moves the most, then the price is going to decrease. And obviously, if we had both of them moving in the other direction, those would exactly flip. That is to say, if supply and demand are both decreasing, quantity will definitely decrease. If demand shifts more, then price will decrease. If supply shifts more, then price will increase. The natural next question is, what happens if both of them change, but they move in opposite directions? In the case of supply increases, demand decreases, then price will decrease. And should think about, if supply increases, that has a tendency to push price down. If demand decreases, that has a tendency to push price down. So both of those move to change price downward. The question is, what happens to quantity, which you as a consumer may not much care about, but the producers in the market certainly do. If demand shifts more, then the quantity will decrease. If supply shifts more, then the quantity will increase. Conversely, if supply decreases and demand increases, okay, so let's think about how that might work. Suppose you went into the market to buy a particular good and suddenly there were less producers of that good and everybody wanted them suddenly. Then you would anticipate that price would increase, which in fact it would. If demand shifts more, then the quantity will also increase. That is, the price is increased enough that it entices new producers in. On the other hand, if supply shifts more, then quantity will decrease. So, if we wanted to look at what's all the possibilities here, here you have them all in a chart. In this chart, we have supply changes on the on one axis and demand changes on the other axis, and they're all put together in one place, in one location, and these just essentially match what we've just said. Now, there are times when it might get completely unpredictable, when the movement is such that you wouldn't really know which way to go, and that could happen and cause it to be indeterminate. Now, there are times in which we have disequilibrium in the market. This especially happens as the market is dynamically changing from one point to another, as it's changing from one price point to another, and this can happen because we overshoot our boundaries. As we were looking at our pizza example, we kind of overlooked the fact that we might very well overshoot. So we're selling pizzas for $12, we find that we've got a surplus of them, and we might, instead of going to $9, we might go to $8, thus creating a shortage. Oftentimes when a market is dynamic, that is, when it's changing on us, we overshoot where we need to get to. We don't know that $9 is the appropriate amount, and so instead of going to $9, we go to $8. And when this happens, the market is said to be in disequilibrium. It's gone from a surplus to a shortage. Now, sometimes for non-economic reasons, we actually force markets into disequilibrium. This oftentimes happens because there is some social reason to control the price. There's some reason that the government wants the price to be a certain amount, and thus we force it into a disequilibrium state. That can occur in one of two ways. We can either set a minimum price or we can set a maximum price, and let's look at both of those. In the first case, we set a price floor, which is a minimum price which is above the equilibrium price. Now, if we set a minimum price and it's at the equilibrium price, obviously it doesn't matter. But if we set a minimum and we say the price can't go below this amount and it's above the equilibrium price, then it will create a surplus. This, of course, distorts the market. It entices the market into producing more than it should based on the signals we've given it, and it reduces economic welfare. And a great example of this are price supports for agricultural products, and you see in the picture there, milk's a prime example of this. In the case of milk, we have set a minimum price that the farmer can receive for his production of milk. If it drops below that number, then we buy up whatever we need to in order to support that price. And that's precisely the reason that the U.S. government ends up with a lot of cheese, because the best way to store milk is through making it into cheese. The other possibility is we could set a price ceiling. For some non-economic reason, we might decide that we don't want the price of a good to go above a certain level. You know, again, if we set that number above the equilibrium price, it doesn't matter. But if we set a maximum which is below the equilibrium price, then what we will do is generate a shortage. And in generating a shortage, again, we distort the market because we have told producers not to produce the product when in fact there is a demand for the product. And again, it reduces economic welfare. And the prime example of this is rent controls. With rent controls, which were placed in New York right after World War II and still are in effect in certain places, they've actually set a maximum price that you can charge for rent. And so as a result, there's a shortage of apartments. Now here's the graphical version of these. You see over in panel A, we've set a minimum price for a gallon of milk at $2.50. The result is that there are 14 million gallons demanded at that price. There are 24 million gallons supplied at that price. So we have a surplus. We have a milk surplus, which finds its way into becoming a cheese surplus. On the right side, we have a price ceiling for rent. And here we've set the maximum price that you can charge for rent at $600. The equilibrium price, the price on the market, would be $1,000 per month. The result is there are 40,000 units per month supplied. There's 60,000 units per month demanded. So we have a shortage of rental units of 20,000 units. The result is that there are less apartments come on the market, less willingness to rent out apartments, and this exactly tells you why New York City was the beginning of co-ops and various different ways of selling apartments essentially. And so it actually generates a shortage. Same thing on the other side, the equilibrium price for milk would be $1.90 a gallon. By supporting it at $2.50, which is done to try to increase the income for the farmers, we end up generating a surplus. And it'll always be the case that when you impose a price at something different from the equilibrium, which impinges on the market, the buyers and the sellers can't reach the agreement they would like to reach, and so as a result, it affects economic welfare. And we'll see later on that it actually has a bigger effect than that in fact it misallocates resources and it moves resources to the production of goods and services that perhaps consumers don't want. Well, we've put the two of them together, we've reached an equilibrium, we've let the invisible hand guide the producers so that they know what to produce, and we found a way to exchange goods and services from one group to the other group. So we're ready to move on from this point and to investigate a little more deeply the motivations on the two sides of the market and what causes them to behave the way they have. That's all for this time, and we'll see you next time.